The summer of 1994 in East New York, Brooklyn, carried the weight of a neighborhood caught between survival and surrender. The streets hummed with the constant tension of families trying to hold on to dignity while everything around them seemed to be falling apart. On Pitkin Avenue, where the elevated train cast long shadows across cracked sidewalks, the Martinez family had built their life around a simple principle: you protect what's yours, no matter the cost. At 42 years old, Roberto Martinez had weathered more storms than most men twice his age. His hands, scarred from 20 years of construction work, gripped the steering wheel of his yellow Chevrolet Caprice taxi with the same determination that had carried him through the journey from San Juan to Brooklyn 15 years earlier. The car wasn't much to look at, with its dented bumper and passenger door that required a specific combination of pulling and lifting to open properly. But it represented everything Roberto had managed to build in America. His wife Elena would often joke that Roberto loved that taxi more than he loved her, but they both knew the truth ran deeper than affection. That car was their lifeline, generating the $500 a week that kept food on the table for their 3 children and maintained the small 2-bedroom apartment they shared on Bradford Street. Roberto's oldest son, Miguel, had just turned 21 and worked the night shift at the taxi stand with his father. Carmen, 19, attended Brooklyn College during the day and helped Elena clean office buildings in Manhattan 3 nights a week. The youngest, David, was 17 and possessed the kind of street intelligence that made Roberto both proud and worried in equal measure. The Martinez family understood the unwritten rules of survival in East New York. You minded your own business, you worked hard, you looked out for your neighbors, and you never, ever showed weakness. Roberto had learned these lessons the hard way during his first winter in Brooklyn, when a group of teenagers had cornered him outside a bodega on Livonia Avenue and demanded his wallet. He had handed it over without resistance, watching them disappear into the night with 3 days' worth of taxi earnings. Elena had found him sitting at their kitchen table an hour later, staring at his empty hands and promising himself that he would never feel that powerless again. On the morning of August 12, 1994, Roberto woke up at 4:30 a.m., just as he had every morning for the past decade. Elena was already in the kitchen, preparing the strong coffee that would fuel his 16-hour workday ahead. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant rumble of early morning traffic on the Belt Parkway and the occasional siren that served as the neighborhood's perpetual soundtrack. Roberto kissed Elena goodbye, grabbed the thermal cup of coffee she had prepared, and headed downstairs to where his taxi waited under the flickering streetlight. The morning shift started routinely enough. Roberto picked up Mrs. Chen from her apartment on Pennsylvania Avenue, taking her to her job at the garment factory in Sunset Park. He drove a young mother and her crying baby to Brooklyn Hospital, waited while she kept her appointment, and drove them back home. By 10 a.m., he had already earned $43, putting him on pace for a decent day. The radio crackled with dispatches from other drivers, the familiar voices creating a sense of community among men who spent their days navigating the city alone. Around noon, Roberto stopped at Tony's Deli on Atlantic Avenue to grab a sandwich and call home. Elena answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a woman who had been cleaning offices until 3 in the morning. She told him that Carmen had an exam that afternoon and that David was supposed to be at his summer job at the auto parts store, though she suspected he was probably hanging around the basketball courts on Sutter Avenue instead. Roberto promised to pick up groceries on his way home and reminded Elena to keep the deadbolt locked until he returned. The call that would change everything came through the taxi dispatch at 12:47 p.m., a pickup at 1247 Blake Avenue, destination LaGuardia Airport. The fare would be worth at least $40, maybe $50 with tip, and Roberto was close enough to the location that he wouldn't waste gas getting there. He pulled up in front of a narrow three-story building wedged between a beauty salon and a check-cashing place, the kind of structure that housed three families in spaces meant for one. Three young men emerged from the building, moving with the casual confidence of people who owned their surroundings. The leader, a tall kid with intricate braids and a gold tooth that caught the afternoon sun, approached the driver's side window. He was probably 19 or 20, wearing an oversized Chicago Bulls jersey and jeans that hung low enough to reveal the waistband of expensive underwear. His companions looked younger, maybe 17 or 18, both wearing similar uniforms of sports jerseys and gold chains. The kid with the gold tooth leaned down to Roberto's window and asked if this was the taxi going to LaGuardia. Roberto confirmed the destination and popped the trunk so they could load their luggage. Instead of bags, however, the three young men climbed into the back seat empty-handed, which should have been Roberto's first warning. The second warning came when the kid with the gold tooth asked Roberto to take a detour through Brownsville before heading to the airport, claiming they needed to pick up a fourth passenger. Roberto hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him something wasn't right, but the promise of a larger fare and the broad daylight gave him enough confidence to agree. He pulled away from the curb and headed east toward the cluster of housing projects that defined Brownsville's landscape. The conversation in the back seat was muted but constant, the three passengers speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish that Roberto couldn't quite follow. Every few blocks, one of them would point out a different direction, leading Roberto deeper into an area where he rarely picked up fares. At 1:15 p.m., they reached a dead-end street lined with abandoned buildings and empty lots filled with broken glass and discarded furniture. Roberto realized too late that there was no fourth passenger, no actual destination, and no intention of going to LaGuardia Airport. The kid with the gold tooth suddenly reached over the seat and grabbed Roberto's throat, while one of his companions pressed something sharp against Roberto's ribs through the gap between the seat and door. "Give us the fucking car and your money," the kid hissed, his breath hot against Roberto's ear. Roberto felt the sharp point pierce his shirt and knew he was seconds away from bleeding to death in his own taxi. His hand shook as he reached for his wallet, which contained $87 in cash and the small photograph of his family that he carried everywhere. The kid with the gold tooth snatched the wallet and tossed it to one of his friends, then ordered Roberto out of the car. Roberto climbed out slowly, his legs unsteady and his mind racing through options that all seemed to end badly. The three young men spread out around him, blocking any potential escape routes, and Roberto understood that they intended to leave him stranded in Brownsville with no money and no way to get home. The kid with the gold tooth slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, while his companions climbed into the passenger side. As they pulled away, Roberto heard one of them laughing about the old man's face when he realized what was happening. For 20 minutes, Roberto stood alone on that empty street, watching his livelihood disappear into the maze of housing projects and wondering how he was going to explain to Elena that 15 years of building a life in America had just been stolen by three kids who probably weren't old enough to vote. He eventually found a working payphone outside a corner store and called Miguel, who was supposed to be sleeping before his night shift, but instead rushed across Brooklyn to pick up his father. The ride home was silent except for Roberto's quiet recounting of what had happened. Miguel listened without interruption, his hands gripping the steering wheel of Elena's battered Honda Civic with increasing intensity. When Roberto finished the story, Miguel asked only one question. "Did you get a good look at them?" Roberto described the three young men in detail, particularly the kid with the gold tooth, who had seemed to be in charge. Miguel nodded thoughtfully and suggested they file a police report, though they both knew that stolen taxis in East New York rarely generated much investigative enthusiasm. Elena was waiting in the apartment when they returned. Having sensed from Miguel's tone during his brief phone call that something serious had happened, Roberto told her the story while she made him tea with honey, her face growing more concerned with each detail. Carmen arrived home from her college classes an hour later, followed eventually by David, who claimed he had been at work, despite the motor oil conspicuously absent from his fingernails. The family sat around their small kitchen table, processing the reality that their primary source of income had just vanished. The financial implications were immediate and devastating. Without the taxi, Roberto couldn't work, which meant the family's weekly income had just dropped by nearly 80%. Elena's cleaning job brought in maybe $200 a week when she could get enough buildings to clean, and Miguel's night work at the taxi stand generated perhaps another $100. Carmen's part-time job at a clothing store in downtown Brooklyn contributed $60 on a good week. David's summer job, when he actually showed up, might add another $50 to the family budget. Roberto spent that evening calling every insurance company, taxi dispatcher, and police station he could think of, but the responses were uniformly discouraging. His insurance would eventually pay something toward a replacement vehicle, but the process would take months, and the settlement would barely cover half of what he needed for another taxi. The police took a report, but explained that car theft was such a common crime in Brooklyn that individual cases rarely received focused attention unless someone was seriously injured or killed. By 10 p.m., the Martinez family had calculated their immediate options and found them all inadequate. They had perhaps $800 in their savings account, enough to cover rent and groceries for maybe 3 weeks if they were extremely careful. Roberto could look for construction work, but those jobs were increasingly scarce and typically paid much less than he could make driving a taxi. Elena could try to pick up additional cleaning contracts, but her current schedule already kept her working until 3 or 4 in the morning most nights. The conversation that would change everything began around 11 p.m., when David mentioned that he had seen the stolen taxi parked outside a housing project in Brownsville earlier that afternoon. Roberto asked how David could possibly know this, and David reluctantly admitted that he had skipped work to hang out with friends in that area. Miguel immediately wanted to know the exact location, while Elena demanded to know why David hadn't mentioned this information earlier. David explained that he had recognized the taxi by its distinctive dent pattern and the Puerto Rican flag decal that Roberto had placed on the rear windshield. He had thought about approaching the car, but noticed several young men standing around it, including one who matched Roberto's description of the kid with the gold tooth. David had decided to leave the area rather than risk a confrontation, but he was confident he could find the location again if necessary. Miguel proposed calling the police with this information, but Roberto pointed out that car thieves typically didn't keep stolen vehicles in easily identifiable locations for very long. If the taxi was still in Brownsville, it would probably be moved or stripped for parts within a day or two. Elena suggested that maybe they should just focus on finding Roberto another way to earn money and forget about recovering the taxi. But the family's finances made that option seem unrealistic. The idea that would ultimately lead to tragedy emerged from David's suggestion that maybe they could take the car back themselves. Roberto initially dismissed this as too dangerous, but Miguel pointed out that they had a right to recover their own property if the police weren't going to help them do it. Carmen argued that vigilante justice was a terrible idea that could get someone killed, but David countered that letting thieves steal everything you owned was also a form of surrender that could destroy the family. The debate continued until nearly 1 in the morning, with each family member advocating for a different approach. Roberto wanted to exhaust all legal options before considering anything else. Elena believed they should accept the loss and find another way forward. Carmen thought they should wait and see if the insurance settlement might be better than expected. Miguel was convinced that taking action themselves was their only realistic option for recovering the taxi quickly enough to preserve Roberto's livelihood. David insisted that they at least go and see if the car was still where he had spotted it. Elena finally ended the discussion by announcing that she was too tired to think clearly, and that they should all sleep on the decision before doing anything irreversible. The family dispersed to their rooms, but none of them slept much. Roberto lay awake, wondering if 15 years of building a life in America were about to end because of one afternoon's bad luck. Elena stared at the ceiling, calculating how long their savings might last if Roberto couldn't find work quickly. Miguel mentally reviewed everything he knew about the streets of Brownsville and the kinds of people who might be willing to steal a taxi in broad daylight. Carmen spent the night reading her textbooks and trying to focus on her upcoming exam, but her mind kept returning to stories she had heard about families who had lost everything and never recovered. David lay in the bed he shared with Miguel, listening to his older brother's restless turning and thinking about the faces of the young men he had seen around the stolen taxi. He remembered particularly the confident way they had carried themselves, as if the entire neighborhood belonged to them. The next morning brought no new solutions, but plenty of additional pressure. Roberto called every taxi company in Brooklyn looking for work, but most required drivers to provide their own vehicles. The few companies with fleet cars available had waiting lists several months long. Elena's supervisor at the cleaning company mentioned that they might have additional buildings available for cleaning, but the work would require her to travel to Manhattan every night and wouldn't pay much better than her current schedule. Miguel had worked his night shift at the taxi stand and returned home with disturbing news. He had asked around about car thefts in Brownsville and learned that a crew of young men had been systematically stealing taxis and other vehicles throughout East New York and Bedford-Stuyvesant. According to the other drivers, this crew was known for being particularly brazen and violent, often beating drivers who resisted and sometimes stealing cars in broad daylight. The police were apparently aware of the situation, but hadn't made any arrests. This information changed the dynamic of the family's discussions considerably. If Roberto's taxi had been stolen by an organized crew rather than opportunistic teenagers, the chances of recovering it through official channels seemed even more remote. At the same time, the prospect of confronting organized criminals rather than random car thieves made any direct action significantly more dangerous. David insisted that they at least go and see if the taxi was still where he had spotted it, arguing that gathering information wasn't the same thing as taking action. Roberto was reluctant to involve his youngest son in anything potentially dangerous, but Miguel pointed out that David was the only one who could identify the exact location. Elena absolutely forbade the idea of David going anywhere near Brownsville, but David argued that he went to that area regularly and knew how to avoid trouble. The compromise they reached was that Roberto and Miguel would go to Brownsville without David, who would provide detailed directions to the location where he had seen the taxi. If they spotted the car, they would observe from a distance and then decide whether to call the police or consider other options. Eleanor insisted that under no circumstances should they approach the vehicle or confront anyone, and Carmen made them promise to call home every hour to confirm they were safe. At 2 p.m. on August 13th, Roberto and Miguel drove Elena's Honda Civic toward Brownsville, following David's detailed directions to a cluster of housing projects near the intersection of Blake Avenue and Christopher Avenue. The afternoon was oppressively hot, with temperatures reaching the mid-90s and humidity that made the air feel thick enough to swim through. The streets were crowded with children playing in the spray of open fire hydrants and adults sitting on stoops trying to escape the heat of their apartments. They found the location David had described about 20 minutes later, a courtyard surrounded by 3 housing project buildings, where residents had set up folding chairs and tables to create an outdoor social area. Roberto's taxi was indeed parked along the edge of the courtyard, looking exactly as it had when he left it the previous day, except for the absence of his small Puerto Rican flag decal. The car appeared undamaged, and Roberto could see his rosary still hanging from the rearview mirror. More importantly, they could see the 3 young men who had stolen the car. The kid with the gold tooth was sitting on the hood of the taxi, talking animatedly to a group of perhaps 6 or 7 other young men who appeared to be listening to him with respectful attention. Roberto recognized the other 2 car thieves standing nearby, apparently serving as some kind of security or lookouts for the group. The entire scene suggested that these weren't random criminals, but rather members of an organized crew with established territory and hierarchy. Roberto and Miguel observed from their car for nearly an hour, parked far enough away to avoid attention, but close enough to monitor the situation around the taxi. During this time, they watched several other young men approach the group, engage in brief conversations with the kid with the gold tooth, and then leave with what appeared to be small packages. The implications were obvious, even from a distance. This crew wasn't just stealing cars, but also dealing drugs from a location they considered secure enough for open operation. This realization fundamentally altered Roberto's thinking about the situation. Recovering his taxi would mean confronting not just car thieves, but also drug dealers who had chosen this location specifically because they felt confident about controlling it. The risks of any direct action had just multiplied exponentially, but the alternative was accepting the destruction of everything Roberto had built in America. Miguel suggested that they return home and develop a more comprehensive plan, but Roberto was reluctant to leave without at least attempting to reclaim his property. He pointed out that the taxi represented 15 years of his life, and that replacing it would take money the family simply didn't have. Miguel agreed, but argued that getting killed or seriously injured wouldn't help the family's financial situation either. Their debate was interrupted by the approach of 2 young men who had apparently noticed their prolonged presence in the area. Roberto and Miguel quickly drove away, but not before getting a clear look at the faces of their potential confronters. Both appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. Both were wearing expensive jewelry and clothing, and both moved with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested they were accustomed to intimidating people. The drive home was tense, with Roberto and Miguel each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Roberto was processing the reality that his taxi had become part of a criminal operation that extended far beyond simple car theft. Miguel was calculating the number of people they would potentially have to confront and wondering whether his family possessed the resources and determination necessary for such a confrontation. Eleanor was waiting anxiously when they returned, and she listened to their report with growing alarm. The news that drug dealers were involved made her even more opposed to any direct action, and she insisted that they contact the police immediately with the location information. Roberto called the precinct and spoke to a detective who seemed interested in the drug-dealing aspect of the situation, but much less concerned about the stolen taxi itself. The detective explained that recovering stolen property from drug dealers typically required extensive surveillance and coordination with narcotics units, processes that could take weeks or months to organize. He suggested that Roberto's best option was to work with his insurance company and accept that the taxi was probably gone permanently. The detective also warned that any attempt to recover the vehicle independently would be extremely dangerous and potentially illegal if it resulted in violence. This conversation crystallized the family's dilemma. The official channels offered virtually no hope of recovering Roberto's livelihood quickly enough to prevent financial disaster, but unofficial action would require confronting an organized criminal operation with unknown resources and capabilities. Elena advocated for accepting the loss and focusing on survival, while Miguel argued that the family had no choice but to fight for what belonged to them. Carmen suggested a middle course, contacting local community organizations or political figures who might be able to pressure the police into more aggressive action. David, however, had a different perspective based on his knowledge of street dynamics in their neighborhood. He argued that the drug dealers had chosen their father as a victim specifically because they assumed he wouldn't fight back, and that proving them wrong might be the only way to prevent future targeting. The conversation continued through dinner and into the evening, with each family member gradually revealing their true feelings about their situation. Roberto admitted that losing the taxi felt like losing his identity as a provider and protector, emotions that went far beyond simple financial concerns. Elena acknowledged that she was terrified of losing Roberto or one of her children, but also recognized that accepting victimization might encourage further criminal targeting of their family. Miguel revealed that he had been researching the crew that had stolen their taxi and learned disturbing information about their methods and reputation. According to drivers at the taxi stand, this crew had been responsible for at least a dozen vehicle thefts over the past 6 months, often targeting older immigrant men whom they perceived as unlikely to resist or retaliate. Several victims had been beaten severely when they attempted to resist, and at least 2 had required hospitalization. Carmen expressed her fear that any violence involving their family would jeopardize her college education and future career prospects, concerns that Roberto took seriously but couldn't allow to override his immediate responsibility to provide for the family. David argued that their neighborhood respected only strength, and that allowing the theft to go unchallenged would mark the Martinez family as easy targets for future crimes. The decision that would ultimately lead to tragedy emerged gradually over the course of several hours, as each family member came to understand that none of their options offered clear solutions or guaranteed safety. Elena's preference for avoiding confrontation made sense from a safety perspective, but offered no realistic path toward economic recovery. Carmen's suggestion of seeking official help had already proven ineffective. Miguel's inclination toward direct action carried enormous risks, but might represent their only chance of recovering Roberto's livelihood. Roberto finally announced his decision around 11 p.m. on August 13th. He would return to Brownsville the following day, accompanied by Miguel and David, and demand the return of his taxi. If the thieves refused, he would call the police from the scene and insist on immediate action. If the police were unwilling or unable to help, he would consider taking the car back by force, understanding that this choice carried serious risks for everyone involved. Elena initially refused to accept this decision, arguing that Roberto was risking the family's safety for the sake of pride rather than practical necessity. Roberto replied that providing for his family was his most fundamental responsibility as a husband and father, and that failing to recover his means of earning a living would be a form of abandonment. Miguel supported his father's position, while Carmen continued to advocate for patience and official channels. David's perspective proved crucial to the family's final decision. He pointed out that word of Roberto's victimization was probably already spreading through the neighborhood's informal communication networks, and that the family's response would determine how they were perceived and treated in the future. Accepting the theft without resistance would mark them as easy targets, while fighting back might earn them the respect and protection that came with being known as people who couldn't be intimidated. Elena finally agreed to Roberto's plan, but only with strict conditions. The family would approach the situation as a group, presenting a united front that might discourage violence. They would attempt negotiation first, offering to pay a reasonable sum for the return of the taxi. If negotiation failed, they would demand police intervention before considering any other options. Under no circumstances would anyone carry weapons or initiate violence, and if the situation became dangerous, they would retreat immediately. These conditions satisfied Carmen's concerns about safety and legality while preserving Roberto's determination to recover his property. Miguel and David agreed to follow Roberto's lead in all decisions, and Elena insisted on accompanying the group to ensure that her conditions were observed. The family spent the remainder of the evening discussing strategy and contingency plans, though none of them fully appreciated the complexity and danger of what they were about to attempt. The morning of August 14th brought unseasonably cool weather to Brooklyn, with temperatures in the mid-70s and a steady breeze that felt like a gift after the oppressive heat of the previous day. Roberto woke up at his usual 4:30 a.m., but instead of preparing for his normal taxi routine, he spent an hour reviewing the plan he and his family had developed the night before. Elena had barely slept, and she spent the early morning hours cooking a large breakfast that no one had much appetite for eating. Miguel and David were both unusually quiet, each processing the reality of what they were about to attempt in his own way. Carmen had left for school early, claiming she had additional studying to do before her exam, but actually unable to bear watching her family prepare for what she feared might be a disaster. Elena had taken the day off from her cleaning job, explaining to her supervisor that she had a family emergency that required her immediate attention. At 9 a.m., the 4 remaining family members climbed into Elena's Honda Civic for the drive to Brownsville. Roberto had decided to bring $300 in cash, money scraped together from their savings, and Elena's tip money from the previous week as a potential purchase offer for the return of his taxi. Elena carried a notebook with the telephone numbers of every police precinct in Brooklyn, along with the badge number of the detective who had expressed interest in the drug-dealing operation. Miguel had brought a baseball bat that he kept hidden under a blanket in the back seat, despite the family's agreement to avoid weapons. David served as navigator, directing them through the maze of streets that led to the housing project courtyard, where they had spotted the taxi the previous day. The drive took nearly 40 minutes because Roberto was being extremely careful to obey all traffic laws and avoid attracting police attention before they were ready. Elena spent most of the trip reviewing their strategy and reminding everyone of the conditions she had insisted upon. They arrived at the location around 10 a.m. and were relieved to find Roberto's taxi still parked where they had seen it the day before. The courtyard was less crowded than it had been the previous afternoon, with perhaps a dozen people sitting on benches or standing in small groups, rather than the larger gathering they had observed earlier. The kid with the gold tooth was immediately visible, standing near the taxi and engaged in conversation with 2 older men who appeared to be in their 30s. Roberto parked the Honda Civic about 50 yards away from the taxi, positioning the car for a quick exit if necessary, but close enough to observe the situation clearly. The family spent several minutes watching the courtyard activity, noting the positions and apparent relationships of the various people present. Elena counted at least 15 young men who appeared to be associated with the crew that had stolen Roberto's taxi, while Miguel focused on identifying potential weapons or other threats. The approach strategy they had agreed upon was for Roberto to walk directly to his taxi, accompanied by Miguel and David, while Elena remained with the car and prepared to call police if necessary. Roberto would identify himself as the taxi's owner and politely request its return, offering the $300 as compensation for any inconvenience. If this approach was rejected, Elena would immediately call the police while Roberto and his sons retreated to their car. This strategy lasted approximately 30 seconds after Roberto began walking toward his taxi. The kid with the gold tooth spotted them immediately and called out to his associates, who quickly moved to surround Roberto, Miguel, and David before they could reach the vehicle. Within moments, the Martinez family found themselves confronted by approximately 8 young men, including the 3 who had stolen the taxi 2 days earlier. The kid with the gold tooth demanded to know what Roberto was doing in their neighborhood, speaking with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested he considered this territory to be under his control. Roberto explained calmly that the yellow taxi belonged to him and that he had come to retrieve it, offering to pay a reasonable amount for its return. The response was immediate laughter from several members of the crew, followed by profanity-laced threats about what would happen to Roberto if he didn't leave immediately. Miguel stepped forward to support his father's position, explaining that the taxi represented the family's only source of income and that they desperately needed it returned. One of the crew members, a stocky young man with elaborate tattoos covering both arms, responded by pushing Miguel hard enough to knock him backward. David immediately moved to help his brother, but found himself facing 2 other crew members who seemed eager for an excuse to escalate the confrontation. Elena watched this development from the car and began dialing 911. But her call was interrupted by one of the crew members who had noticed her presence and approached the Honda Civic. He demanded to know what she was doing, and when Eleanor explained that she was calling police, he reached through the car window and grabbed the phone from her hands. Elena found herself effectively trapped in the car, unable to complete her emergency call and afraid to leave the vehicle. The situation in the courtyard was deteriorating rapidly. Roberto's attempt at peaceful negotiation had been met with increasing hostility, and several crew members were now making explicit threats about what would happen if the Martinez family didn't leave immediately. The kid with the gold tooth claimed that Roberto had sold the taxi to him, and that any attempt to reclaim it would be considered theft. When Roberto protested this obvious lie, the kid responded by pulling out a knife and suggesting that Roberto might want to reconsider his position. Miguel reacted to this threat by retrieving the baseball bat from under the blanket in Elena's car, a decision that immediately escalated the confrontation beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. The appearance of the bat prompted several crew members to produce their own weapons, including knives, chains, and at least one handgun that Roberto could see clearly. Within seconds, a simple property dispute had transformed into a potentially deadly armed confrontation. Elena was screaming for her family to return to the car, but Roberto realized that retreat might no longer be possible. The crew members had spread out to surround the Martinez family, blocking access to their vehicle and making it clear that they considered themselves to be in control of the situation. The kid with the gold tooth was now speaking in rapid Spanish, apparently giving instructions to his associates about how to handle the intruders. David, who had been relatively quiet during the initial confrontation, suddenly stepped forward and addressed the kid with the gold tooth directly. He pointed out that the crew was operating in broad daylight with multiple witnesses present, and that seriously injuring or killing 4 members of a local family would inevitably bring police attention that could shut down their entire operation. This observation seemed to give the crew leader pause, though it also seemed to increase his anger about the situation. Roberto seized on this moment of uncertainty to make a final negotiation offer. He pulled out the $300 cash and offered to triple the amount if they would simply return his taxi and allow his family to leave peacefully. He explained that he understood the crew's position, but hoped they could understand his family's desperation. The money represented nearly everything the Martinez family had left, and Roberto's willingness to offer it demonstrated both his desperation and his determination to avoid violence. The kid with the gold tooth took the money and counted it carefully, apparently considering Roberto's offer seriously for the first time. He consulted briefly with the two older men who appeared to be his advisors, speaking in voices too low for Roberto to overhear. For a moment, it seemed as though the situation might be resolved through negotiation after all, despite the weapons that remained visible on both sides of the confrontation. The decision that would lead to violence came not from the crew leadership, but from one of the younger members, a teenager who had been standing near the edge of the group and apparently felt that his peers were showing too much weakness by negotiating with the Martinez family. This young man, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, suddenly stepped forward and declared that nobody should be allowed to disrespect their crew by making demands on their territory. Before anyone could react, this teenager picked up a piece of broken concrete from the ground and threw it at Roberto, striking him in the shoulder hard enough to knock him backward. Miguel immediately swung his baseball bat in the teenager's direction, though he didn't make contact with anyone. The sound of the bat cutting through the air seemed to trigger something in the crowd, and within seconds, multiple fights had broken out simultaneously. Elena later testified that the violence seemed to explode from multiple directions at once, making it impossible to track individual actions or decisions. She could see Roberto struggling with two crew members near his taxi, while Miguel swung his baseball bat wildly in an attempt to reach his father. David had apparently been tackled by someone and was fighting on the ground, while Elena herself was trying to exit her car to help her family. The turning point came when the kid with the gold tooth apparently decided that the situation had gone too far and needed to be ended quickly. Elena watched him pull out his handgun and begin moving toward the center of the fighting, apparently intending to use the weapon to restore order. Instead, Miguel spotted the gun and charged directly at the crew leader, swinging his baseball bat toward the young man's head. What happened next would be debated in court proceedings for months afterward. According to Elena's testimony, Miguel's bat connected with the kid's gun hand, causing the weapon to discharge into the air and then fall to the ground. The crew leader stumbled backward but wasn't seriously injured, while Miguel dove for the fallen handgun. Other witnesses claimed that Miguel deliberately struck the crew leader in the head, causing serious injury, and that the gun discharge was the result of Miguel's attack rather than an accident. Regardless of the sequence of events, the gunshot seemed to paralyze everyone in the courtyard momentarily. Roberto used this pause to reach David and pull him to his feet, while Miguel maintained control of the handgun that had fallen during his struggle with the crew leader. Elena was screaming for her family to return to the car, but the crew members were no longer attempting to block their escape route. Instead, the crew seemed to be regrouping around their leader, who was sitting on the ground holding his head and apparently trying to determine whether he was seriously injured. Several crew members were pointing at Miguel and shouting about the gun, while others seemed more concerned with helping their leader assess his condition. The brief pause in violence gave the Martinez family an opportunity to retreat that hadn't existed moments earlier. Roberto made the decision that would define the rest of the confrontation. Instead of retreating to Elena's car and leaving the area, he walked directly to his taxi and climbed into the driver's seat. The keys were still in the ignition, apparently left there by the thieves who had been using the vehicle. Roberto started the engine and called for Miguel and David to join him in recovering their property. This decision to reclaim the taxi rather than simply escape transformed what might have been a simple fight into something much more complex and dangerous. The crew members realized that they were about to lose not only the stolen vehicle, but also face and reputation in their own neighborhood. Several of them began moving toward the taxi, apparently intending to prevent Roberto from driving away with it. Miguel, still holding the crew leader's handgun, climbed into the front passenger seat of the taxi while David got into the back seat. Elena was forced to choose between abandoning her car to join her family in the taxi or following them in the Honda Civic. She chose to follow in her own car, though this decision meant that the family was now split between two vehicles in a dangerous situation. Roberto pulled away from the curb slowly, trying to avoid hitting any of the crew members who were still standing around the taxi. Several young men pounded on the windows and attempted to block the vehicle's path, but Roberto managed to navigate through the crowd without running anyone over. Elena followed closely behind in her Honda Civic, watching her rearview mirror for signs that the crew might be pursuing them. The pursuit that Elena had feared began almost immediately. At least 3 carloads of crew members followed the Martinez family as they attempted to leave the housing project area, apparently determined to prevent them from escaping with the taxi. Roberto was unfamiliar with the maze of streets surrounding the projects, and his attempt to find the fastest route out of Brownsville led him into several dead ends and one-way streets that slowed their escape. Miguel was now holding the crew leader's handgun and watching the pursuing vehicles, trying to determine whether they contained additional weapons or how many people were involved in the chase. David was providing navigation assistance to Roberto, while Elena tried to stay close enough to the taxi to avoid being cut off by their pursuers. The convoy of vehicles moved through Brownsville at speeds that attracted attention from pedestrians and other drivers. The chase continued for nearly 15 minutes, winding through residential streets where children were playing outside and adults were sitting on stoops enjoying the pleasant weather. Roberto was desperately trying to reach a major thoroughfare where he might find police presence, but the pursuing vehicles seemed to be herding him away from busier areas and deeper into the residential maze of Brownsville. Elena later described this period as the most terrifying 15 minutes of her life. She could see armed young men in the pursuing vehicles and realized that her family was seriously outnumbered and outgunned. At the same time, she was proud of Roberto's determination to reclaim their property and Miguel's courage in supporting his father's decision. David was proving himself to be more mature and capable than any of them had realized, providing crucial navigation assistance that kept them ahead of their pursuers. The confrontation that would ultimately define the entire incident occurred when Roberto was forced to stop at a red light at the intersection of Blake Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue. The pursuing vehicles immediately surrounded the taxi and Elena's Honda Civic, trapping both cars in what amounted to a coordinated ambush. At least 12 crew members emerged from the various vehicles, all apparently armed with knives, chains, or other weapons. The crew leader from the original confrontation was among the pursuers, apparently having recovered sufficiently from his earlier injury to join the chase. He approached Roberto's window and demanded the return of his handgun, along with additional money as compensation for the disrespect the Martinez family had shown to his crew. When Roberto refused, the crew leader signaled to his associates, who began attacking both vehicles simultaneously. Elena found herself surrounded by young men who were attempting to break her car windows while demanding that she unlock her doors. Roberto was trying to drive through the intersection despite the red light, but several crew members had positioned themselves in front of the taxi to prevent its movement. Miguel was pointing the captured handgun through the taxi window, apparently trying to discourage the attackers without actually shooting anyone. The violence that erupted at this intersection would later be described by witnesses as unlike anything they had ever seen in a neighborhood that was accustomed to street fighting and criminal activity. Instead of a brief confrontation between individuals, this became a sustained battle involving multiple weapons and vehicles that lasted for several minutes and attracted the attention of dozens of witnesses. David was the first to realize that their only chance of survival lay in taking aggressive action rather than trying to defend themselves passively. He rolled down his window and began striking attackers with a tire iron that Roberto kept in the taxi for emergencies, managing to force several crew members away from the vehicle. Elena, meanwhile, had managed to lock her car doors and was leaning on her horn continuously in an attempt to attract police attention. Miguel made the decision that would ultimately save his family's lives, but also lead to the most serious consequences of the entire incident. He fired the captured handgun through the taxi window, apparently aiming over the heads of the attackers in an attempt to scare them away rather than injure anyone. The sound of gunfire immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation, with several crew members diving for cover behind parked cars. However, Miguel's warning shot also prompted return gunfire from at least 2 other weapons. Elena heard multiple gunshots and saw muzzle flashes from several directions, though she later testified that she couldn't determine who was shooting at whom or whether anyone had been hit. Roberto was still trying to drive through the intersection, but the combination of attacking crew members and civilian vehicles trying to flee the area created a traffic jam that prevented movement in any direction. The gunfight that ensued lasted perhaps 90 seconds, but seemed much longer to everyone involved. Elena crouched below the dashboard of her Honda Civic, trying to avoid the gunfire while maintaining visual contact with her family in the taxi. Roberto was using the taxi itself as cover, positioning the vehicle between his family and the most heavily armed attackers. Miguel was returning fire selectively, apparently trying to suppress the attackers' weapons rather than necessarily hit specific targets. David had armed himself with a second tire iron and was defending the taxi's rear window against crew members who were trying to break into the vehicle. Elena could see him fighting with remarkable intensity and skill, apparently drawing on knowledge of street fighting that she hadn't known he possessed. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Martinez family was holding their own against attackers who'd expected them to surrender quickly. The arrival of police sirens in the distance seemed to trigger a decision by the crew leadership to disengage from the confrontation. Elena watched as several crew members began retreating to their vehicles, apparently recognizing that continuing the fight risked serious legal consequences. The crew leader was among the last to withdraw, apparently reluctant to abandon the confrontation, but ultimately unwilling to face police investigation. Roberto seized this opportunity to drive through the intersection, despite ongoing gunfire from a few remaining crew members who seemed determined to continue fighting, regardless of police arrival. Elena followed closely behind. Though her Honda Civic had sustained damage from the attackers' attempts to break her windows, both vehicles managed to escape the immediate area of the confrontation, though Elena could see additional crew vehicles beginning to follow them again. The chase that resumed after the intersection gunfight was different from the earlier pursuit because police sirens could now be heard approaching the area from multiple directions. Roberto was driving toward the nearest police station, while Elena tried to flag down any patrol cars they might encounter. The pursuing crew vehicles seemed less coordinated than before, with several apparently deciding to abandon the chase rather than risk police contact. Miguel was monitoring their pursuers while conducting a quick inventory of their ammunition and weapons. The captured handgun contained 3 remaining bullets, and David had located additional tire irons and a crowbar in Roberto's emergency toolkit. Elena's car had suffered damage but was still drivable, though she was having difficulty seeing through her rear window, which had been cracked during the intersection attack. The final confrontation of the day occurred when Roberto pulled into the parking lot of the 75th Precinct, apparently believing that reaching police headquarters would end the pursuit and provide protection for his family. Instead, several crew vehicles followed them into the parking lot, and at least 6 crew members emerged with weapons, apparently intending to finish the confrontation despite the police presence. This decision by the crew to attack the Martinez family in a police station parking lot would later be cited as evidence of their reckless disregard for legal consequences and their determination to maintain their reputation for violence. Elena honked her car horn continuously while Roberto and his sons prepared to defend themselves once again, this time with the expectation that police would respond within seconds. The gunfight that erupted in the police station parking lot lasted less than 30 seconds, but resulted in the most casualties of the entire day. Miguel was forced to use his remaining ammunition to defend his family against attackers who seemed determined to kill them, regardless of the consequences. David fought with both tire irons simultaneously, managing to disable at least 2 attackers before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Roberto left the relative safety of the taxi to help David, using the crowbar he had retrieved from his emergency toolkit to fight off crew members who were trying to surround his youngest son. Elena watched her husband and sons fighting for their lives in a police station parking lot, while officers began emerging from the building to respond to the gunfire and chaos. The arrival of armed police officers ended the violence immediately, with crew members either fleeing on foot or attempting to blend in with bystanders who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Several attackers were too severely injured to escape and were arrested at the scene, while others managed to reach their vehicles and leave the area before police could stop them. The Martinez family remained in the parking lot, surrounded by police officers who were trying to understand what had just occurred. Elena's first priority was determining whether any of her family members had been seriously injured during the various confrontations. Roberto had sustained cuts and bruises, but no major injuries, while Miguel was bleeding from a knife wound on his arm that would require stitches but wasn't life-threatening. David had multiple injuries, but was conscious and able to walk, though he would later be diagnosed with a concussion from being struck in the head during the intersection fight. The police investigation that followed would consume the next several months and ultimately result in dozens of arrests and prosecutions. The crew that had stolen Roberto's taxi was revealed to be part of a larger criminal organization involved in drug dealing, car theft, and other crimes throughout Brooklyn. The violence in the police station parking lot provided evidence that prosecutors needed to pursue serious charges against the crew leadership. However, the Martinez family also faced potential legal consequences for their role in the day's violence. Miguel's use of the captured handgun, even in self-defense, raised questions about weapons possession and the circumstances under which citizens could legally defend themselves. Roberto's decision to reclaim his taxi rather than wait for police assistance was characterized by some prosecutors as vigilante justice that had unnecessarily escalated the situation. The legal proceedings that followed lasted nearly 2 years and ultimately resulted in mixed outcomes for everyone involved. The crew leader and several of his associates were convicted on charges ranging from car theft to attempted murder and received prison sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Other crew members accepted plea bargains in exchange for testimony against their leadership, while a few managed to avoid prosecution by disappearing from the area entirely. Miguel was charged with illegal weapons possession, but ultimately received probation after prosecutors acknowledged that he had acted in defense of his family. David was not charged with any crimes, though his knowledge of street fighting and his effectiveness during the confrontations raised questions about his previous activities that were never fully resolved. Roberto faced no criminal charges, but became something of a neighborhood celebrity for his willingness to fight for his property and family. Elena later described the aftermath of August 14, 1994, as both triumphant and traumatic for their family. Roberto had successfully recovered his taxi and could resume earning a living, which prevented the financial disaster they had feared. At the same time, the violence had left psychological scars on all of them and changed their relationship with their neighborhood in ways that took years to fully understand. The reputation the Martinez family gained as a result of their confrontation with the car theft crew had unexpected consequences throughout East New York. Roberto found that other taxi drivers and business owners treated him with new respect, and several offered partnerships or opportunities that hadn't been available before. Elena discovered that her neighbors viewed her differently, with some expressing admiration for the family's courage, while others seemed nervous about being associated with people who had been involved in such serious violence. Miguel used the experience as motivation to pursue legitimate opportunities for advancement, eventually completing his high school education and finding steady work in construction. However, he also struggled with recurring nightmares and anxiety about potential retaliation from surviving crew members or their associates. David's behavior became more serious and responsible after the confrontation, though Elena worried that he had learned lessons about violence that might influence his future decisions in dangerous ways. Carmen had missed the actual confrontation because of her college classes, but she returned home to find her family changed by their experience in ways that took months to fully comprehend. Her academic performance improved dramatically as she became more determined to achieve professional success that might allow her to help her family avoid future crises. She also became more involved in community organizations, working to address the crime and poverty that had created the conditions for their confrontation. The taxi that had started the entire crisis continued to serve Roberto's family for another 8 years, though he eventually replaced it with a newer vehicle purchased through a loan that his improved reputation helped him secure. He continued driving in Brooklyn until his retirement in 2010, and he never again became the victim of a serious crime. Elena often said that criminals in East New York learned to recognize Roberto's taxi and understood that attacking it would bring consequences they weren't prepared to handle. The long-term impact of the Martinez family's decision to fight for their property extended far beyond their immediate neighborhood. Their story became part of the folklore of East New York, told and retold in barbershops, community centers, and family gatherings throughout Brooklyn. Some versions emphasized Roberto's courage and determination, while others focused on the violence and legal consequences that resulted from their decision to take justice into their own hands. Law enforcement officials cited the Martinez case as an example of how citizen action could complement police efforts to combat organized crime, though they continued to discourage vigilante justice as potentially dangerous for everyone involved. Community leaders used the story to illustrate both the failures of official protection and the risks of unofficial responses to those failures. Social workers and teachers reference the case when discussing the complex relationship between individual families and the broader systems that were supposed to provide safety and justice. Miguel eventually married and started his own family, though he chose to raise his children in New Jersey rather than Brooklyn. He maintained close relationships with his parents and siblings, but never felt entirely comfortable returning to the neighborhoods where the confrontation had occurred. His wife later said that Miguel rarely discussed the events of August 14, 1994, but that she could see their influence in his determination to provide security and stability for his own children. David pursued a career in law enforcement, eventually becoming a police officer in Long Island, where his understanding of street dynamics and his personal experience with violence proved valuable in community policing efforts. He credited the confrontation with teaching him the importance of standing up for what was right, though he also learned to appreciate the value of working within legal systems rather than outside them. His supervisors noted his unusual ability to connect with crime victims and his effectiveness in situations involving family conflicts. Roberto continued driving his taxi until age-related health issues forced him to retire, though he occasionally returned to work part-time when Elena needed additional medical care. He never expressed regret about his decision to fight for his property, though he acknowledged that the confrontation could easily have resulted in tragedy for his family. Elena often said that Roberto became a different man after August 14th, 1994, more confident in his ability to protect his family, but also more aware of how quickly ordinary situations could become matters of life and death. Elena herself became involved in community organizations focused on immigrant rights and neighborhood safety, using her experience to help other families navigate crises involving crime and law enforcement. She frequently spoke at community meetings about the importance of family unity in the face of adversity and the need for neighbors to support each other when official systems failed to provide adequate protection. Her work eventually led to recognition from Brooklyn Borough President and other political leaders who valued her insights into the challenges facing working-class immigrant families. Carmen completed her college education and eventually became a social worker specializing in family crisis intervention. Her professional work was deeply influenced by her family's experience, and she often used their story as an example of how ordinary families could find extraordinary strength when facing seemingly impossible challenges. She maintained that the violence of August 14, 1994, was regrettable, but that her family's willingness to fight for their dignity and economic survival had been absolutely necessary. The criminal crew that had stolen Roberto's taxi and precipitated the confrontation was effectively destroyed by the arrests and prosecutions that followed. The kid with the gold tooth received a 15-year prison sentence for his leadership role in the car theft operation and his use of weapons during the confrontation. Several of his associates received shorter sentences, but still faced significant prison time that removed them from the streets during what would have been their most active criminal years. The broader criminal organization that the crew had been part of was severely disrupted by the police investigation that the Martinez confrontation had triggered. Prosecutors used evidence gathered during the investigation to pursue charges against dozens of individuals involved in car theft, drug dealing, and other crimes throughout Brooklyn. Several high-ranking members of the organization were convicted and received lengthy prison sentences that effectively ended their criminal careers. However, the success of law enforcement efforts to dismantle this particular criminal organization was offset by the emergence of new groups that moved into the territory and markets that had been abandoned. Elena noted that crime in Brownsville didn't disappear after the prosecutions, but rather evolved and adapted to the new conditions created by increased police attention. Roberto observed that younger criminals seemed more cautious about targeting taxi drivers, but more willing to use violence in other types of crimes. The political and social implications of the Martinez family's confrontation with organized crime extended into broader discussions about urban policy and law enforcement strategy. Some politicians cited their case as evidence that communities could successfully fight back against criminal organizations if they had the courage and determination to do so. Others argued that the violence demonstrated the need for more effective police protection that would make citizen action unnecessary. Community activists used the Martinez story to illustrate the complex relationship between immigrant families and American institutions. They pointed out that Roberto's willingness to fight for his property reflected both his determination to succeed in America and his lack of confidence that official systems would protect his interests. Elena's involvement in community organizations after the confrontation was cited as an example of how traumatic experiences could motivate positive civic engagement. Academic researchers studying urban crime and immigrant communities found the Martinez case useful for understanding how families respond to systemic failures in law enforcement and economic opportunity. Several doctoral dissertations and academic papers analyzed various aspects of their confrontation, from the tactical decisions made during the fighting to the long-term psychological and economic consequences for the family members involved. The media coverage of the Martinez family's confrontation was extensive but inconsistent, with different news outlets emphasizing different aspects of the story depending on their political perspectives and target audiences. Some reporters focused on the family's courage and determination, portraying them as heroes who had stood up to organized crime when police protection failed. Others emphasized the violence and legal ambiguity, suggesting that vigilante justice created more problems than it solved. Roberto appeared on several television talk shows and radio programs in the months following the confrontation, though he eventually became uncomfortable with the media attention and began declining interview requests. Elena was more willing to discuss their experience publicly, particularly when speaking to community groups or advocacy organizations. Miguel and David both avoided media attention, preferring to let their parents serve as family spokespersons when public comment was necessary. The financial impact of the confrontation was ultimately positive for the Martinez family, despite the legal expenses and medical costs they incurred. Roberto's enhanced reputation led to better taxi stand assignments and more lucrative routes, while Elena's community involvement opened doors to better-paying cleaning contracts. Carmen's social work career was enhanced by her family's experience, and David's law enforcement career benefited from his understanding of street dynamics. However, the psychological costs of the violence took years to fully manifest and address. All four family members experienced periods of anxiety and hypervigilance that required counseling and support. Elena developed a particular sensitivity to sudden loud noises, while Roberto became obsessively careful about securing his taxi and monitoring his surroundings while working. Miguel struggled with anger management issues that affected his relationships, and David had difficulty trusting authority figures despite his own law enforcement career. The neighborhood changes that followed the Martinez confrontation were gradual but significant. The removal of the car theft crew and the broader criminal organization they had been part of created opportunities for legitimate businesses and community organizations to expand their activities. Several new immigrant families moved into the area, attracted by lower crime rates and the reputation for community solidarity that the Martinez case had helped establish. However, these positive changes were accompanied by other developments that concerned long-time residents. Increased police attention in the area led to more frequent stops and searches that some community members found excessive. The reputation for violence that the neighborhood gained as a result of the Martinez confrontation attracted some criminal elements while deterring others, creating a complex and unpredictable security environment. Property values in the immediate area around the Martinez home increased modestly in the years following the confrontation, though Eleanor was never sure whether this reflected reduced crime rates or the general gentrification trends affecting much of Brooklyn. The family eventually moved to a larger apartment in the same neighborhood, choosing to stay close to the community that had supported them during their crisis, while upgrading their living conditions with the improved income Roberto's enhanced reputation had generated. The legal precedents established by the Martinez case influenced several subsequent prosecutions involving citizen self-defense and property recovery. Prosecutors and defense attorneys frequently cited various aspects of their confrontation when arguing cases involving similar circumstances. Law enforcement agencies used their tactics and decisions as training examples, both for strategies to emulate and mistakes to avoid. The Martinez family's story became part of the oral history of East New York, passed down through community networks and family traditions that preserved both the factual details and the symbolic significance of their confrontation with organized crime. Children who had been too young to understand the events when they occurred grew up hearing different versions of the story from parents, grandparents, and older siblings who emphasized different lessons and themes. Roberto died in 2018 at the age of 76, having lived to see his children establish successful careers and his grandchildren grow up in neighborhoods much safer than the one where he had raised his own family. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including former taxi drivers, community leaders, and several police officers who had investigated the 1994 confrontation. Elena spoke at the service about Roberto's courage and determination, crediting those qualities with everything their family had ultimately achieved. Elena continues to live in Brooklyn as of 2023, though she has moved to a quieter neighborhood where she helps care for her grandchildren and remains involved in community organizations. She occasionally speaks at events commemorating the Martinez confrontation, though she prefers to focus on the positive changes their experience helped bring to East New York, rather than the violence itself. Her perspective on the events has evolved over the decades, emphasizing the importance of family unity and community support while acknowledging the risks of the choices they made. Miguel has become a successful construction contractor in New Jersey, employing several dozen workers and specializing in residential renovation projects. He rarely discusses the 1994 confrontation publicly, but has privately credited the experience with teaching him the importance of standing up for his principles and protecting his family's interests. His relationship with his parents and siblings remains close, though geographic distance has limited their day-to-day contact. Carmen continues her social work career and has become a recognized expert in family crisis intervention, frequently consulting with other social workers and law enforcement agencies about techniques for helping families navigate traumatic experiences. She has written several professional articles about the Martinez case, using their experience to illustrate broader principles of resilience and recovery. Her academic work has been recognized with awards from professional organizations and community groups. David retired from law enforcement in 2020 after a 25-year career that included assignments in patrol, detective work, and community policing. His supervisors consistently noted his exceptional ability to understand criminal behavior and his effectiveness in dangerous situations, qualities they attributed to his personal experience with street violence. He has since become a private security consultant, drawing on both his police experience and his family's 1994 confrontation to advise businesses and individuals about personal safety. The criminal justice system changes that followed the Martinez case included enhanced penalties for organized car theft operations and improved coordination between different law enforcement agencies investigating related crimes. Several police departments modified their training programs to include scenarios based on the Martinez confrontation, teaching officers how to respond when citizen action had escalated beyond official control. The community organizing efforts that Elena joined after the confrontation contributed to broader improvements in police-community relations throughout East New York. The organizations she worked with successfully advocated for additional police patrols, improved street lighting, and community programs designed to provide alternatives to criminal activity for young people. These changes helped reduce crime rates and improve the quality of life for residents throughout the area. The story of the Martinez family's confrontation with organized crime continues to resonate in discussions about immigration, community safety, and the relationship between individual action and institutional responsibility. Their experience illustrates both the potential for ordinary families to overcome extraordinary challenges and the complex consequences that can result from decisions made under extreme pressure. 29 years after the events of August 14, 1994, the Martinez family's legacy in East New York remains visible in the community organizations Elena helped establish, the improved police relationships that resulted from their case, and the countless other families who found inspiration in their example of courage and determination. Their story serves as a reminder that sometimes ordinary people must take extraordinary action to protect what they have built, even when the consequences are uncertain and the risks are severe. The broader lessons of their experience continue to influence discussions about urban policy, immigrant rights, and community safety throughout New York City and beyond. Politicians, law enforcement officials, and community leaders still reference the Martinez case when debating the proper balance between individual action and institutional responsibility for public safety. Their story has become part of the complex narrative of how American communities adapt and respond to the challenges of crime, poverty, and social change.